Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming back to what I think is the last lecture for today. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk about the vulva and what making a game about the vulva had taught me and us, me and my design team, about shame and pleasure in digital gaming. So just a brief note about myself. So my name is Sabine and I'm an academic. Actually, I'm a humanities academic. My training, my formal training is in English studies and communication studies from the University of Vienna, and I just wrote my PhD thesis on attachment and grief in video games. I'm also part of something called the Copenhagen Game Collective, which is a loose group of friends, artists, indie game developers and thinkers who together curate and organize events in the Nordic region. And sometimes we get together and we make experimental stuff. Some of those who know me also refer to me as a panographic artist, and I won't spoil what this is, but you will find out soon enough. And this is how you can follow me. So, some games I made are about themes such as pregnancy loss, growing up as a Catholic in Austria. It's a wearable game with Arduino enhanced praying outfits. And the themes like romance, flirtation, and touch. Now, these are maybe design topics that you might not be expecting from games in general, but they do have something in common. They're all about some kind of connection. So, Jokoi, the game that is about pregnancy loss, is about the connection, a metaphorical connection, between a mother sheep and her little lamb. Pray for Absolution, which is a Catholic game, is about a physical connection between the prayers and the holy interface. And Lovebirds is an awkward beaking game, which is connecting two beaks to make your light flash. And Get Your Rocks On is a physical rock flirtation game that uses rocks as a platform for flirtation and verbal expression of affection. So that's some games that I made, but today I will talk about the Cunt. Cunt Touch This is a game I made with these lovely people, namely Ida Toft, who's the programmer on the project, Raimund Schumacher, who's the artist, Andrea Brasch, who is a game designer, and Tee Corinne's Legacy, which will basically remixed in an attempt to honor her achievements for feminist art in the 70s. So why the cunt? Why the vulva, the vagina, the clitoris, the labia? Now, personally speaking, the vulva is something that's very close to my heart. And it's something that's very close to your heart, perhaps as well. As a matter of fact, it might only be some centimeters away from your heart. For the Americans among you, that's inches. But if you take a look around you, you will notice that perhaps the distance between you and the vulva is not that long. In fact, they're among us. They breathe, they're here. They live. So the actual question to be asking is, how come there exist so few vulva games? Now, Cunt Touch This, and I pride myself to be part of this team, Cunt, who made maybe one of the first vulva games in the digital cultural world of gaming. And that's a shame. Because it points to a status quo of us having perhaps a few issues with this topic. So do we have issues, and what kind of issues do we have with the vulvas? the cunts, the vaginas, the clitorises, the labia? Let us find out. I'm going to start. This is the agenda for today. So I'm going to start with the historical context and a couple of myths that have been circulated around the vulva. Then from there I go towards Cunt Touch This and the game conception, and moving from there to public play, the responses we got for the game, ending with the question of market control. And this is something that Adam, thank you for spoiling my point on that, but I'm basically reiterating what the silencing of the cunt means for our collective pleasure as digital gamers. So, without further ado, let's jump into the historical context, and the points that I'm going to make, you can read about them in the essay that is that you see here. It's called Socio-Cultural Representations of the Vagina. Mind you, there's put a little thing here that means that the vagina is actually not the correct word. They use the vagina as a reference for the whole organ, including all the parts that are visible, when in actuality, strictly speaking, this is not the case. So the vulva is the correct term to refer to all the visible parts of the organ, while the vagina is only about it just describes the part that is the most relevant for heterosexual sex, aka the penis-centered perspective on sex. So that's also the reason why I use vulva in this talk instead of vagina, even though it might be more popular to say vagina. Also say vagina a lot. Keep doing it. So I'll go through these tropes, starting with trope number 7 and counting down. Trope number 7 is the vulva as inferior to the penis. Now, does anyone recognize this model? Or have you seen this model before? I see one nod. Who has seen this model before? Okay, apparently it's not that well known. This is the so-called one-sex model that has been dominating sexual discourse or our language around sexuality from the ancient Greeks until the 17th century. And the basic idea is that the vulva to the right is basically an inverted penis. So there's the idea that sexuality is one thing, and it has different permutations, 2 permutations. One of them is the correct one, the substantial one, the thing that is there, the penis and the scrotum, and the other thing is the thing that is inferior, the vulva, the thing that is just internal and therefore not really relevant. An inside-out penis. Now, this idea has changed in the 17th century towards a 2-sex model, but the basic hierarchy of the penis as a thing and the vulva as a non-thing has persisted. We can see that in popular culture and in the trope number 6, which is vulva's absence, in toy culture. So the penis, as defined as something, as defined by being something, and the vulva is defined as being nothing, helps reproduce this notion of the vulva as absence. So if you look at this most iconic doll we have, the Barbie doll, you see a paradox here. You see that the Barbie has a hypersexualized body. She has protruding breasts, she has permanent makeup even, but there's no real representation of labia whatsoever. And this feeds into the next myth, which is the vulva is inadequate, and this alarming growing trend of labioplasty as the surgical intervention which is done in order to correct the labia to make it more Barbie-like. This is actually an inspired ideal and also the common term referred to this kind of intervention. So the vulva is inferior, the vulva is inadequate, it needs to be changed. But why does it need to be changed? Because we have another myth. The vulva is passive and is perfectly fit as an organ accommodating the penis. and waiting for the semen to be introduced by a man who is owning agency. So, yes, the vulva is not good enough for the penis, needs to be corrected, and so on. This goes hand in hand with myth number 3, the vulva is abused, and this has a wider implication in history. So if we think about colonial history and the representation of the female body and sexuality in colonialism, it's often used as a metaphor, speaking of metaphors, for a land to be discovered and owned. So the implication is that sexual violence is a perfect narrative, a perfect metaphor to assist our meta-narrative of domination. And the vulva is, in these narratives, of course, associated with male power, but also with rape and torture. Just think about the implications of the Virgin Island, just the name of the Virgin Islands and what it invites. It's basically an invitation to own something that has not been discovered before, which also means that it has not been discovered by the owners. We also find a narrative of abuse. The vulva is abused in medicine. Just think about our discourse of STIs and how at-risk vulvas are to being invaded by something as evil as STIs and even unwanted pregnancies. So there's this image of the abused vulva. Do you have enough already, or should I move on to the real tropes? Which is the vulva is disgusting. So the vulva is often associated with something disgusting, unclean, smelly, something that's ugly and funny looking, something that is definitely not the beautiful part of our bodies. And there's also, that has also something to do with the construction of the female body as something mysterious, as dirty, oozing, strange fluids that are not oozed by men's bodies. And in marketing culture, we find a lot of genital douches, products that give us the feeling we need to be less smelly, like scented panty liners, and also applicators, tampons applicators that teach us how to not touch our vulva. And last but not least, the trope of the vulva is dangerous. So in popular culture, we have this construction of the vulva as a source of horror, fear, and danger. The myth of the so-called vagina dentata, the toothed vagina, the toothed vulva. This is a recurring motive, actually a global phenomenon, a global trope that has been reproduced, and it's a favorite trope of horror games. Just think of the Alien series. Here you see the egg. Designed beautifully by H.R. Giger. And actually, the first concept that H.R. Giger made of this egg only had one slit. That was retracted by the movie director because it looked too much like a vagina. Can't have that, or a vulva. So, where does that leave? This is quite some baggage to be carrying around, some cultural baggage. And I mean, where does that leave us? It's kind of understandable that this is something that might make us crawl and hide behind a bush and not face the topic of vulvas anymore. But the reason why I'm going into this historical baggage is also to give you an idea of what we were completely ignorant about when we designed Cunt Touch This. Because when we conceived the game, we had an idea that the vulva was something that had been liberated long time ago by our mothers and their radical feminist friends in the 70s, you know? It's something that we no longer have to deal with. It's something that we already know that the vulva is a pleasure organ, and not only is it active, it can lengthen it. Oh, okay. I apparently broke the presentation. Okay, so you don't get to see more cunnilingus. It's unfortunate. continue. So, and one of the reasons why we were so blissfully unaware is because we were in a safe space in Denmark as a game jam, where Andrea happened to have the Cunt Coloring Book on her, which was the main inspiration for our game. And we reclined into our dorm room at a nice folk high school in Denmark in the countryside, and we were blissfully unaware of all of this baggage. And we said, well, this is beautiful. This is mesmerizing. This book is showing so many permutations of the vulva that we usually don't see in mainstream culture, in mainstream porn, where we don't see these things. These are actual drawings from real women's vulvas. And so not only does this book display a variety of vulvas, it also utters an invitation to engage, because after all, it's a drawing book, a coloring book. So it asks you to grab a crayon and engage and appropriate the cunt for your own pleasure, and a recreational pleasure. It's an innocent pleasure. It's reminiscent of childhood activity. Right, so it's not only you literally drawing attention, by drawing the vulva, you literally draw attention to the vulva as not only a sexual thing, but a beautiful form to engage in and to maybe spend some recreative time with. And so this is the Exile Game Jam poster from the origin of Cunt Touch This. So we didn't find this at all problematic, because we were in this gym hall, coding the game, discussing things, lounging in the outdoors, playing around with the objects that we made there, sharing our stories over the campfire, and engaging in massage trains. So actually here you can see, and I realized that yesterday when looking at my slides for the first time, that you can see the whole team Cunt in the very background of this image. So you see all of us, the four of us, basically on the the leftmost four people in the back is our team. So this is a perfect context to explore the things that really matter to us. Maybe they wouldn't work at the end of the game jam after the 3 days. Maybe they were crap, but they would really matter to us. They would really make us feel good and warm and fuzzy inside. So this is basically the reason why we made the game, and this was our blissful approach to the cunt. So the Cunt Coloring Book. It was clear to us that this should be turned from physical paper to the tablet. Right? That is like an obvious thing to. When you look at the vulvas, they already look like a level. So the idea is that by making that digital and available for digital play and painting, you could actually also get rid of this paper factor where you have to throw away the book after you colored it, or you can store it somewhere. You can actually continue to paint the vulvas forever until you die. So it's a very sustainable tool for cunt coloring, the tablet. So what we did first, we put some 2D sprites into Unity, and we added a color wheel that is unlike real life. What you can do with digital culture and digital gaming is you can make the color wheel shift colors and make it procedural. So you can have the freedom. We tried to make it as realistic as possible by including as many red tones and brown notes as we could find. But we also included some punk options, like very neon colors. So everyone, casual and hardcore gamers, could get what they needed from cunt coloring. So you start out with So yeah, we put that on a tablet. Then the second thing is that we realized when we programmed this game, you actually need to define the stroke intensities, right? So what mark do you leave behind when you color the vulva? And we implemented 2 painting styles. The first one is the contemplative painting style, which is slow, caressing, and you see that represented on the left. When you paint the vulva slowly, you get a lush kind of, visceral, emotional style. But then there's also the second style, which is the let's fuck it mode, where you just rub and then you get some graffiti-like coloration. So the second one is more about being ugly, being wild, but not caring because all you need to do is just come. We realized that by translating the vulva coloring dynamic from a paper to a digital material, something else was happening. While the Cunt Coloring Book is colored by painters who have a distance to the book in the form of a crayon. So there's always a distance between your hand and the book that you're coloring. On the screen, something else was going on. Namely, you're suddenly touching your finger on the screen. Revolutionary for a touch screen, but we didn't think of the ramifications of that for the coloring game. It means that like this loss of the crayon is kind of a loss of a moral safety net, because suddenly you're doing a little bit of something else. You're not only coloring, you're perhaps, I don't know, pleasing. So a controversial decision in our design team has been to exploit the fuck out of this. You can edit that out in the video. So we decided to ride on this wave of pleasure giving on the tablet by defining a pleasure range that is represented on the interface, hidden, you don't see it, but it takes place on the top part of the screen somewhere. And if you touch there, something else will happen. Namely, after touching it for a certain length, a random pleasure range. It's like in real life. We basically just finally coded real life into a game. Artificial intelligence. You will trigger a so-called cunt transformation. It's actually a shame that this whole code is something that you cannot see while playing the game because it's fucking poetry. This is code poetry, and Ida's main interest was in producing this kind of poetry while programming the game. So we didn't make bug fixes, but we made language fixes in order to make the code more beautiful. Anyway, so this is something that that the game decides inside of a random time window, randomized time window. You are triggering the Cunt transform. And what does that mean? Let's see whether that works. So this is what's happening. All right, so that was Cunt transform, the function Cunt transform. So this is a moment of no control and no return. Sorry, no agency for you, but all the more agency for the cunt. The cunt just comes on your finger. There's nothing you can do about that. But since it's a nice cunt, it will thank you for your efforts. It will say thank you and will recommend her other friends to you. Now, how has this been received by the public? It's a good question. What do players make of this? What happened when this game hit the public somehow? Needless to say, there were various responses. Some including responses where we said, yeah, this is exactly what we wanted to do. Fun, yes, good game. Enjoy it by you, great. The other responses, there were some other responses where we went, wow, where did this come from? And one of these what the fuck moments was the first time we presented this game to the semi-public at the Game Jam. We actually won an award, which was the most least feminist game award. So, why are you laughing? Already the name of this award shows that there's some sort of insecurity going on. We don't know, that probably has something to do with feminism, but I'm not quite sure what. And there's this uncanny feeling that it's awkward, but it's also powerful. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gotten an award for it. There was some similar, just to give you an overview of all this kind of response. There's a similar response when I asked a friend of mine, whose consent I have to show the following video, did the following thing.
Ah! What did I do? Okay. I have to color it in. Is it making? Right?
Now, the first thing that happens when the friend is presented with the game is a little scream. Ah! What do I need to do? Is the next question that follows up, because he's a game designer, he has the answer. Oh, I have to color it in. And then there's this moment of when he realizes is there sound. There's some sound. But he decides not to touch that spot again, because, mind you, I'm filming this. And instead, he is making a beautiful meandering pattern around the labia. Yes, so what is going on here? What is that? How is the dynamic working? A British colleague and friend of mine summarized, who were also exposed to this experience of playing the game in public, recounted that beautifully, and I would like, please excuse me, but I'm going to read his quote now. You will see a wall of text, so don't be afraid. This is the only wall of text. So this friend said that the instructions of the game were straightforward. Color in the picture. However, I was very suspicious that there had to be something more involved, as spectators had raised eyebrows and were giving each other knowing looks. I guessed that the movements of my fingers on the touchscreen were probably being measured and that something would happen as a result. I tried to convince myself that this was completely normal, the same as coloring in any other body part. Given the social context of playing in public, the close topographical similarity between the coloring action and the sexual act, the wish not to react to the content of the coloring, and yet the desire to complete the game, this was a really interesting example of social gameplay experience. So I think what this beautifully illustrates, or rather narrates, is that for him, this whole assemblage of play and the social dynamics were very interesting and evocative of this feeling of embarrassment. And this theme of embarrassment and shame is something that we got a lot from particularly white male journalists who had somehow felt inclined to cover this game because it popped up at several game events. And so, for instance, an Austrian newspaper reporter of the newspaper The Standard, which, if you don't know, it's a quality newspaper. In this newspaper, the author or the journalist speculates about our intentions with making the game, which is, he says that the feeling of embarrassment is an intended part, it's the lower part of this quote, the game experience is an intended part of the experimental setup. And the original word is Versuchsanordnung. yeah. So basically summarizing his feelings there. This is of course not the only responses we got, just let me quickly walk through that until I get back to embarrassment. We also had this coverage of kill screen, which gave us the honor of arguing that we're reclaiming one of the most taboo words. Mind you, we were ignorant of that because none of us are native speakers and of English, so we don't have this baggage of this whole native speakers' shame baggage with this word. And the reason why I used cunt in our game is because we wanted to continue the legacy of Tee Corinne using that term. We found this was an okay term to use. So reclaiming that does us a little bit of more honor than we deserve. But there were also other players that experimented, that took this game as an occasion to experiment with themselves and their bodies and use this as a tool for self-exploration. This is possible. This is a possible and totally legit way of playing the game. We also received beautiful fan art on Twitter. And if you're playing the game at some point and you're making a work of art that you find totally shareable, then please do it. We will publish it on our website. And then my favorite response to the game was after someone played it at a maze, a festival in Berlin, where we had it installed with a huge screen where everyone could see the live drawing. Someone painted the vulva until the final pixel that is broken, so you cannot fill it in, removed his earphones, turned around and said, "This was liberating." But nevertheless, the question remains, where does the embarrassment come from? Why is it that we leave some players in this state of complete shock and perhaps shame? Is it because we have these tropes that are still around in our heads and that are infusing us with ideas? Maybe there are some aspects of this history of vulva shaming that have sedimented in our minds and in our associations with the vulva, and that come to the fore in moments of play. And if shame and embarrassment is still a big aspect of what we experience while we play, how can play ever be an innocent activity? Perhaps it isn't. Perhaps all of what you are learning in game design and fun and entertainment discourse is just wrong. Perhaps games are also, on top of being entertainment and fun, always tools of ruling social expectations and powers that just pop up during casual moments of play. So, on a broader scale, though, of cultural regulation, it's very difficult for something embarrassing and shameful, particularly if it had like a history of centuries of embarrassment, to become liberating and normal. It's very difficult. And this brings me to the question of market control and the question whether we can't publish it. So, there's a market, a gaming market, that controls what's worth publishing and what needs to be silenced. And this is also not an innocent or trivial thing. It's also not only about a matter of what sells and what doesn't sell on a market, but also of what is socially acceptable. And as long as there is a collective culture of shame around the vulva, there is no place in the gaming market for this. This applies to genitals more generally, but let's stick with the example of the vulva and go to an example that is not self-published. So we self-publish Cunt Touch This, so it doesn't really apply here, but when we go to a mainstream market and attempts of people who have done something similar like Cunt Touch This trying to enter a market, let's see what happens with that. So the example that has been mentioned already is La Petite Mort by the Danish company Lovable Cult. And so this is basically how you play the game. You don't really see the pixelated vulvas so well, but they are there. They're real photographs taken from women's vulvas. And so the idea is the same as with Cunt Touch This. It's to appropriate the touch device as a pleasure organ. And however, this has a bit more sophisticated algorithm in the background. There's some beautiful musical compositions accompanying each vulva. And the vulva actually has a dialogue with the user. So you get little prompts telling you what they like and what they don't like. And Apple refused to publish this game. And it rejected the game through a guideline that says, if you want to describe sex, write a book or a song or create a medical app. This is a place where sex games are relegated to right now. However, there's something weird going on. Because there are vulva games that are right now published on the iOS market. Can anyone guess which one I'm referring to? Yes? Bingo! Exactly. This game is openly about female sexuality. In fact, so this is how I play. There's also little prompts telling you what to do, but the makers of the game have even said that they were inspired by their own research, their private research on female sexuality that they then translated into a game. And it just happened to be more fitting to them to make that in a metaphorical way. So this is what they say. They say it was a hard choice, but once we started thinking more about color and lightheartedness in combination with the gestural controls of the touchscreen, it began to have a better expression of sexuality for us. So the way they do it is through tunnels and floral patterns, and that is apparently acceptable for the iOS market. Which brings us to the question, whether the vulva is only acceptable in our gaming market if it is hidden and is abstracted through fluffy metaphors or undangerous images that we can better deal with in our society. And in a way, this is perhaps, I will talk more about allegorical games tomorrow, and I'm guilty as charged of making them my own. But I think that there's some discussion to be had about this question in how far metaphors are also a way of perhaps silencing some of the experiences that are necessary to address, and that, as Adam said, would be necessary to expand our ideas of what is possible in terms of passing as a game that is possible to represent out there. So my final point is basically that, so my suggestion is that normalizing the vulva takes more than just metaphorically handling it. The vulva needs to become our edgy companion. It needs to become active, and it needs to be full of surprises in order to really push the edges and the boundaries of what is possible. Because only then can it be proudly celebrated as yet another feature of life that happens to be very close to our hearts. Thank you for your attention. I think there's time for some questions, and here's the microphone. Yes, thank you.
So you said that on the iOS market that they specifically have like stopped and not let games like this be published. Do you think that if there was a greater need, like if there were more people that expressed interest in games like this, that would shift the market to want to go that way? Or is it the other way around where more games need to be developed like this to shift the market?
It's complicated because I think that for the vulva to be really normalized, it takes a long time to actually see the vulva more as a sexual porn-related object. And this would be necessary to broaden the range of what's acceptable to publish, right? So just imagine that all of us would agree that the vulva is no longer an organ of embarrassment, but actually a play companion. That making a game about vulvas would be as normal as making Super Mario, making some character jump over an abyss. In a way, this is also a vulva game, maybe, I don't know. But jumping over the abyss is maybe not the same as looking at the abyss of what we cannot say. So I think that this is a long process, and we need to collectively push that more, which I would suggest start using, start casually talking about the vulva more, or any other genital, to make it more visible, to make it more speakable, and to make it more normal and ordinary. I think this is the key.
Thank you.
So, as kind of a follow-on question for him, you mentioned that you went through self-publishing. How did you go about distributing your game, and to what devices did you distribute? And then, sort of as a secondary thing, is there a way in moving forward, so as designers, if we want to be more of a part of this sort of movement towards more acceptable portrayals of genitalia and develop more socially out there games like this, how do we sort of approach like cross-cultural development, or what route do we take? Is self-publishing the only route to take, or are there established like companies or consortiums or collective that we can like approach and talk to about this subject?
So if I understood your questions correctly, the first part is that we are an experimental, basically art collective. So we do whatever we can to just get our games out there. We're not very methodical. Right now, Cunt Touch This is just on our website. You can just download an APK from there and play it on your tablet, and it should be available right now. I think I fixed it yesterday. So it's simple. You go to a Copenhagen Game Collective website and you get it. So it's kind of a word of mouth thing to get the word out there. But again, it's not a commercial project. I think that ties into the second part of your question, that we need to be more we basically have to get more wanky stuff out there, no matter which way. So I think that the interviewing your inner game designer and approaching this this subject from the point of view of real life experience is a good trajectory to get you started on the design process. And then I think there needs to be more self-publications, and I think also itch.io is a good platform for opening a discussion forum for that, or giving space to more experimental things. And I think that through this critical mass of having more and more wanky games out there that are not shy to address sexuality and sex organ-related experiences to a broader gamer base, or player base, sorry for the G word, I didn't want to offend anyone. So a broader player base, I think that that can dribbled down into the, that can have rippling effects on the AAA or like a bigger market as well, but you should not, I think it's sometimes self-destructive to focus on the market standards, because that is really depressing. And we don't want to be depressed when we make expressions of our own experiences through games.
All right, thank you.
Any further questions? I don't see anyone stand up. So if you're satisfied, thank you for enduring this. And yeah, I think that's it.